I'm Aaron Weintraub, and this is Inside Kurdistan. When there's a massive influx of population due to asylum seekers or refugees from a foreign country, either because of violence or economic instability, environmental crises, or a combination of all of the above, it changes the identity and future of the country that ends up hosting them. And a large part of what dictates the future of any society in this situation is how it finds cultural and economic balance, not in spite of, but because of its refugee population. Every country has had different answers to the surge of refugees fleeing this region in search of stability for themselves and their families. And some countries have opted for closing their borders, and others have realigned their entire DNA in the interest of providing safety and opportunity to people from Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon, and Palestine that are now part of a new generation of Middle Eastern diaspora. And this question of how to deal with people fleeing crises, not just in this region, but also internationally, has become one of the most dominant political and ethical conversations of our time. This episode is being released a little early because today is World Refugee Day, which is a day that has had quite a bit of weight and significance in Kurdistan and Iraq. With the humanitarian crises that have affected the region due to internal conflicts, such as the one that began in 2014 with the rise of the Islamic State or Daesh, as well as violence that continues to this day in Syria, Kurdistan and Iraq have both become a hub for international aid over the past decade in particular. And my guest today is Jean Nicolas Beuze, and he's the head of UNHCR's efforts in Iraq and Kurdistan. And UNHCR, for those unfamiliar with the long list of acronyms that come from the humanitarian world, is the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. And they're in charge, to summarize very briefly, with providing care for refugees and asylum seekers as well as displaced people within their own countries, both of which exist here. And we discussed the current state of Kurdistan and Iraq's needs regarding aid to these people and the political developments that have arisen concerning aid, both with Kurdistan and Iraq, and overall what UNHCR's philosophy is with providing assistance in and outside of camps and what needs to happen moving forward to ensure minimal suffering for the affected populations of people here. He's an excellent authority on all of these subjects. So with all that said, here's my interview with him. Jean Nicolas Beuze, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good morning. How are you?
I think it's best if we start with your own background and your work prior to coming here in Iraq. I know that you worked in Yemen before this. So could you give me some of your background and what led you to working with UNHCR here?
So I started in the human rights humanitarian world some 23 years ago. I worked both at headquarters in Geneva on issues of the prohibition of torture, but I spent most of my time in the field, in Africa, in the Middle East, in Afghanistan. And just prior to coming to Iraq some 6 or 7 months ago, I was the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency representative in Yemen, which is one of the worst humanitarian crises of our time.
And you've come here in 6 months since then, and Kurdistan obviously is a very different situation. It's become somewhat of a hub for other populations, certainly IDPs here, as well as a large Syrian community. And I actually wanted to start with the Syrian community. So according to UNHCR's own data that I'm looking at right now, there's about slightly over 250,000, 260,000 registered Syrian, we'll say refugees, but it's actually asylum seekers, and we'll get into that later. But about half of that population is located here in Erbil. And then there's an urban refugee population, and then there's refugee population in the camp. So since the beginning of 2022, the refugee population here has increased by about 4,000, which is certainly a slower increase than in the past. It's not like in 2015, but I'd still like to know from you what are the needs and priorities of the Syrian population as we stand here in this year?
So let's backtrack for a minute in terms of the timeline.
Mm-hmm.
The crisis in Syria started in 2011. So we are more than 10 years past the beginning of the crisis and past the beginning of the forcible movement of a number of Syrians, mainly to Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and quite a significant number actually to Iraq, mainly to the Kurdistan region of Iraq. So as you rightly stated, some 260,000 Syrian refugees have found asylum in Iraq. Most of them, more than 95% of them, have actually settled in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. Most of them are of Kurdish ethnic origin. They come from northeast Syria, where, as we all know, the fighting is still ongoing. There is still displacement of population. There are still people being killed, maimed by landmines. There's still forcible recruitment of young men. There's still issues of violation of women's rights, gender-based violence, rape, and so on. So a situation which is absolutely not conducive to any kind of return for this population. And actually, any Syrian in KRI, whether it's in Erbil, Dohuk, or Suleimania, has no intention to go back now, because they know that they will be faced with major problems. Out of the 260,000, 60% are living out of camps. So I've been able to integrate into the Kurdish communities. They live, rent places in urban settings or in rural villages. They work like any other Kurdish, often in the informal sector job market. They send their kids to school. They have access to medical care through the primary health center provided by the Ministry of Public Health of Kurdistan region. What is admirable in this situation, and it is really different from the situation of Syrian refugees in the region, is that both the authorities, the Kurdish authorities, but also the Kurdish population have been extremely welcoming of their brother and sister, and have made sure that those people will feel safe and will be given the means to restore their own dignity.
And if we could circle back real quick, you talked about the percentage difference between the urban refugee population and the population in camps. What are some of the different needs those two populations have in terms of aid and just in terms of like living from day to day?
So the living conditions are totally different if you are in a camp or if you are in a, let's say, an urban setting on your own. Mm-hmm. In a camp, the Syrian population does not need to pay rent. Most of the utilities are being provided by the humanitarian partners or by the municipalities, whether you think about garbage collection, access to potable water. I mean, many of those camps, there is also a primary health center, there may be sometimes a school. So everything is provided on site and at no cost for the refugees. Of course, when you live within the Kurdish communities, it's a completely different setup. You have access on an equal footing to all those services, but you have to pay for some of those services when the Kurdish population has to pay for those services. So, for example, the the Syrian refugees have to pay the rent. And they have to find ways to make a living, to pay their electricity bills, their water bills, and so on and so forth. Now, the challenge is to know whether those who are in camps could actually support themselves, be economically self-reliant, autonomous, independent enough for them to move out of the camp, or eventually to start paying for those utilities, such as access to water, garbage collection, and so on, similarly to what is happening to the Syrian refugees or the Kurdish population around them.
The Syrian population here are actually recognized as asylum seekers rather than refugees. And I wanted you to walk me through what is the exact difference between those two statuses here.
So the recognition of the refugee status is not something which is done by UNHCR anywhere in the world. Okay. This is for the government, which is hosting the population, to decide whether they recognize them as asylum seeker or refugees. The first step is to be recognized as an asylum seeker. You come to the country. You may not necessarily have had the possibility to get a visa. You are not coming to be a tourist. You are not coming because you want a job in that country. You are coming because you are escaping violence. You are escaping human rights violation. And there's no other choice for you in a way but to leave your country of origin. So in the case of the Syrians here in KRI. The importance of the asylum seeker recognition is the fact that you came for a certain purpose, which is asking asylum, asking for protection by another state because your own state was unable or unwilling to protect you in the first place and to guarantee your human rights. In that case, what is really important is that you are not being forced back to go back to your country where you will face all those violations. And here again, we have to commend the KRG, the Kurdistan region government, for having accepted all their brother and sister and said, no, we will make sure that you are protected. You can remain on our territory. You are not going to be forced to go back to Kamishli, Raqqa, and so on and so forth. You are welcome here because we understand that you have some protection challenges, protection needs that requires us to be welcoming. It's quite exemplary, but we need to remember also the history of the Kurdish people themselves. There were 30 years ago those who went out of Kurdistan, the Kurdistan region, to be able to get the same type of asylum from neighboring countries, including in Syria at that time. And Syria at that time, the government and the population had been also extremely welcoming, like in Jordan, of the Iraqi population. Now, the difference with the refugee status is one step further, by which it is for the authorities to go through a process where they analyze individually whether the person has an individual fear of persecution if that person was to be returned to a country of origin. In the case of Northeast Syria, you don't need to make this individual determination. Anyone coming from Northeast Syria is at risk for their life, for their well-being, at risk of being arrested, at risk of being tortured, at risk of sexual and gender-based violence, and so on and so forth. So the distinction is one really of a legal nature, but in reality it does not make such a big difference because the authorities here have decided that as an asylum seekers, you are going to be protected and you can remain in the territory of the Kurdistan region of Iraq.
And retain freedom of movement.
And retain freedom of movement, be able to rent places, be able to put your kids in school, access medical care free of charge, and even get a job in the informal sector in particular.
I wanted to talk about actually the differences between the KRG and the Iraqi federal government in terms of treatment of refugees and IDPs, because a very important news story that developed 2 years ago now, but is still continuing, is in October 2020, the Iraqi federal government announced that it will start shutting down camps in the interest, it's quoted from Iraqi state media, of being shut down in the interest of ending displacement in Iraq. And last week, Iraqi state media once again confirmed that the situation is continuing. They're still interested in shutting down these camps, but they're interested in expanding grants and loans to give to families as these camps continue to shut down. There are still 28 camps in total still open, all of which are in the Kurdistan region except for 2. I want to know, do you support the continued closing of these camps? And if they continue shutting down, what is the effectiveness of opening up loans and grants for these families? And what is going to happen to these people?
Let me first clarify that we are speaking about really 2 different groups of population. Previously, we were discussing the situation of Syrian refugees, who are people who cross an international border to seek asylum, to seek protection in another state. In the case of the camps which were closed by the federal authorities in 2020 as as of 2020. We're speaking about Iraqi nationals who were displaced because of the insurgency of Daesh, because of the violence provoked by Daesh and by the response to Daesh. As we all know, Daesh was defeated in 2017, and since then, the objective has been to ensures that people could go back home. Nobody wants to remain in a camp. The camp is not a solution, neither for refugees nor for what we call internally displaced population, so the Iraqi who were displaced. We're speaking about 6.5 million Iraqi out of 41 million had been displaced by the violence created by the insurgency from Daesh. So it's quite a significant number. And therefore, those people were mainly living in camps, in informal sites. Some had the means to rent places in urban center, had moved away from the hot spot where the fighting between Daesh and the coalition or the Iraqi security forces was taking place. So it's natural that after 3 or 4 years, the government and the humanitarian were in agreement, decided to support the return of those Iraqi to their place of origin.
Can you speak to the effectiveness of this compensation as it's gone on? Has UNHCR been working with the Iraqi federal government on this?
So UNHCR has not been directly working because this is really with the authorities, because this is a scheme which has been decided by the authorities, and they are managing it. They are identifying the people who need to receive those grants and those compensation package. They are the one transferring the cash for people to be able to rebuild their life. No doubt that it is making a difference for those who have received the grants. Now we hear that because we are speaking about 6.5 million people having been displaced, we are hearing that not everyone has received the grant. Some are still in the pipeline to receive the grant. Some have yet to make a claim to receive the grant. So it's quite a large endeavor when you speak of when you look at the number of people who could be entitled to receive this support. But there's no doubt that if you want to return home after having lost everything and lived in often desperate and dire situation in a camp or outside a camp during the whole time of Daesh in Iraq, it's clear that you need some financial help to bounce back and resume your life.
And there is a marked difference between the Kurdistan regional government stance on these camps being shut down, which is why most of the remaining camps are in Kurdish territory. How has this political schism between the KRI and Iraq affected UNHCR's work?
The camps in KRI, as you noted, there's still 24, 25 of them, which are in KRIs, have very different profile of population than the camp which were in federal Iraq. Let's take the biggest camps are in Douk. It's approximately 140,000 people, IDPs, Iraqi displaced. They are mainly Yezidi. They are mainly Yezidi who are unable or unwilling to go back to Sinjar, to Sinoni, because they don't feel safe there. They don't know whether their house is still there. Some houses have been destroyed, some houses have been occupied. They don't know what kind of livelihood opportunities they will find. They are not sure about the level and the quality of the services, whether we speak about education or healthcare, and therefore they are not ready yet to return to Sinjar. All of them that I've met over the last 6 or 7 months have expressed interest to go back to Sinjar. It's their place. It's their home. It's their. It's especially for the Yezidi. It's a question of cultural survival, of being together in their place of origin. It has a religious dimension and a social dimension, as we all know. And one of the key humanitarian principles for UNHCR and the humanitarian partners, but which is recognized by the authorities, is that nobody should be forced to go back home if they don't feel that it is the right moment, if they don't feel that they will be safe, if they don't feel that they will have access to those basic services and have some livelihood opportunities. Every of those camps and every of those families in those camps have a different story. And for whatever reason, that we need to respect, does not want to go back. Now, the challenge for UNHCR and the advocacy that we have been making with the Kurdistan region government is that the camp is not a solution. Living in a camp is depriving people from a certain level of quality of life. UNHCR advocacy is that we should not keep people in camps, whether it's Iraqi displaced, Yezidi and other population, or whether it's refugees coming from Syria, Iran, or Turkey. Nobody should remain in a camp, because a camp is not conducive for you to integrate with the community, having access to public services, having jobs. And in terms of social cohesion, it creates really disparities between those in the camp and the surrounding communities.
Well, it stymies social mobility completely.
Totally, and creates this tension where this perception that people in camps have access to better services, or on the contrary, that the services in the camp at a lower quality than the services provided outside the camp. So there's all kind of perception. And on top of that, we need to recognize, and UNHCR, as the UN Refugee Agency, has 70 years of experience, that in terms of cost, the camps are extremely expensive to maintain, because you need to bring all the services to the camp instead of having people going to the existing services within the communities. And something we don't speak too much about, it's also difficult to maintain law and order and security in the camps.
Yes. Yeah, it can be very, those are a huge center for gender-based violence, for example, child abuse, all sorts of issues that come from those camps that are incredibly difficult, impossible, quite frankly, to regulate.
Yeah, because you isolate the population and you don't create the other support network that people will have normally, of being able to interact with their neighbor, being able to interact with the mosque goers, or your traditional and religious philanthropic organization, which are operating in all those communities, especially in the Kurdistan region, where you have a strong sense of solidarity between different communities. By isolating people in a camp, you deprive them of access to those services, basically.
I'd like to focus on a more recent spike in tensions in Sinjar or Shingal. There were violent clashes a month ago between the Yezidi militia Yabasha and the Iraqi military. And there were about 3,500, roughly, primarily Yezidi displaced people because of this. And the Iraqi Ministry of Migration has said, and I quote, this displacement is temporary because the situation is good and has returned to normal again. Where, in your view, does the situation stand with this displaced community, and how temporary do you believe the displacement of this community actually is?
So I was in Sinoni yesterday, and I met some of those families which have been displaced a month ago by these clashes between different armed groups and the Iraqi security forces. They were very keen on stating that for them it was extremely important to return for different reasons. Some of them associated with the fact that they didn't want to live in camps or in KRI. A number of them had been displaced in the past and had returned actually in 2020. So it was the second time in recent years that they were displaced, and they didn't want to stay as displaced populations. They were very keen on coming back to their home. Most of them indicated that they stay between 4 and 10 days in KRI, in Douk in particular. Probably 60 to 70% of those who were displaced last month have already returned to Sinjar. Now, a number of them have flagged challenges in returning. Their house needs some rehabilitation. They are not sure about the level of services that they are going to receive. I met a lot of young people who actually decided to return quite rapidly because they wanted to pass their exams. You remember it was the clashes happened just a few weeks before the final exam for this year. So they absolutely wanted to continue their education. I think it's very clear that for all Iraqis, and certainly the Yezidi, education is absolutely critical. They know that it is a way for them to progress in life. So all those kids, it's quite remarkable to see that all those kids were proud of having come back and wanted to rebuild Sinjar and their communities. And that can only be done if you are back home. If you are in displacement in Dohuk or elsewhere, you don't rebuild your communities, you just survive.
What can you say about the population of people who don't feel safe returning back to Shingal whatsoever?
As we discussed before, nobody should be forced, and nobody will be forced because we have these guarantees from the authorities here in KRI. Nobody will be forced to return. So everybody will do it at his own pace, at her own pace. It depends on your own characteristic. Maybe it's a bit more difficult if you are a single woman with many children. Maybe it's a bit easier if there is a male member of the family who can help reintegrate in the communities. Maybe it's more difficult for persons with disabilities to return. So we need to really look at the individual story behind the displacement, and nobody will be forced. But from what I've heard from all the Yazidi and the other communities, whether it's the Syrian refugees, the Turkish, the Iranian refugees, nobody wants to remain as a displaced person. Nobody wants to be far from home. Everybody wants to be back in their place of origin.
One of the big issues that has come up in 2022 is the crisis in Ukraine. And it has affected both of our fields. It has affected both reporters and humanitarians in terms of funding and being able to secure funding for projects in other areas. And I would just like to hear what you would have to say about the situation with UNHCR's operations in Iraq as funding goes elsewhere, because that happens a lot of the time. And I think a lot of the time we think of UNHCR and the UN in general as this big monolith, but it's in constant and desperate need of funding. And so I'd just like to hear what you think going forward UNHCR in Iraq needs.
Let me take this opportunity to remind everyone that Ukraine is the last of those crises. A bit earlier, we had Afghanistan in August, which went back into the hands of the Taliban, with all kind of displacement of population and all kind of humanitarian needs being created by the change. The radical change of those holding power in Kabul. If we go even 6 months earlier, we had the Tigray crisis in Ethiopia with massive humanitarian needs, with population on the brink of famine. As we mentioned earlier on, I was in Yemen. In Yemen, 80% of the population is food insecure. Iraq is going back to stability. Yes, there is still some insecurity, hotspots, there's still issues. There's a disputed territories between KRI and federal Iraq. There's risk of Daesh sleeping cells operating. There's climate-induced displacement. There's risk related to food security because the prices of food are going up and there's not enough production of food in Iraq. There's all kinds of issues. But it's more and more stable, and the Iraqi government have the financial resources to take care of their own population, eventually even to take care of the Syrian refugee population. We always draw the comparison. When 1 million Syrian refugees arrived in Germany, nobody thought of establishing humanitarian UN program in Germany. We all expected the German government, because they have the resources, the means, the capacities to take care of this 1 million refugees, and they did. I'm not saying that we are yet there entirely for Iraq, but progressively, with both on one side the stability and on the other side the benefits from the oil production, means that we believe that more and more this humanitarian intervention can be taken care of by relevant public institutions. And by and large, there is political commitment and interest to deliver for its own population those services, such as paying compensation and reintegration package for the Iraqi who had been displaced by Daesh.
And finally, I'd like to ask, since it's International World Refugee Day, what is the significance of this day to you personally, and what is its significance to an organization like UNHCR?
So the theme of World Refugee Day this year is access to asylum, access to the territory, access to protection in a non-discriminatory manner. And I think there's two elements to this theme which are critically important for me and for my organization, but I think for many of the listeners to this podcast who want to demonstrate their solidarity with people who are fleeing conflict, who are fleeing persecution. So in terms of access to the territory is making sure that we don't build wall, that we don't block people from arriving in a boat on the Mediterranean Sea or anywhere else by rejecting those people, by pushing them back. Here we have a good example. The KRI, both the authorities and the population welcomed their Syrian brother and sister, as they had welcomed previously the Iranian and the Turkish. And this is really the model that we want to promote. But the second aspect is the non-discrimination, is that whatever is the reason behind the persecution, you should be welcome. Whether it's a conflict, or whether it's because you hold different political opinion, or because you are from a different sexual orientation, or because you pray a different God, these are reasons that need to be recognized for you to get asylum and to be protected by another state, to receive this treatment as an asylum seeker / refugees, because your rights as a person, as an individual, are being violated and cannot be protected by your own state.
Well, I'd like to thank you again for your time.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be on this podcast, and I hope everybody will enjoy our discussion today.
Of course. Cheers. Thanks so much to Jean Nicolas and his team for taking the time to come and talk. If you're interested in UNHCR's projects or interested in donating to their efforts, which I would highly encourage, I've included a link below to their site. Inside Kurdistan is brought to you by the Kurdistan Information Network. You can find our site in another link below at kurdistanin.net. If you have any questions or comments, reach out to us at info@kurdistanin.net. You can find this podcast on Apple, Spotify, Google, and a whole list of other platforms. So if you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks so much for listening. I've been Aaron Weintraub, and this has been Inside Kurdistan.